The thatched roof was still warm against her back. Sarah Broadbrook, 23 years old, daughter of a fisherman, recently married, had spent the last conscious moments before sleep thinking about tomorrow's pilchard catch. The night of June 20, 1631, in Baltimore, Ireland, felt unremarkable. She had no idea that in 4 hours she would cease to exist as herself. Not dead. Worse. She would begin the slow psychological dissolution that happens when your identity, every assumption about who you are, where you belong, what protects you, gets systematically dismantled, piece by piece, until you can't remember what you believed before the breaking began. This is the story of how the Barbary pirates didn't just capture Europeans. They captured something far more fundamental, the architecture of self. And they did it using the same psychological mechanisms that still trap people today, the same cognitive patterns that make intelligent people defend their captors, forget their former selves, and build new identities around their own subjugation. For 300 years, European coastal communities lived with a peculiar form of cognitive dissonance. They knew, intellectually, that Barbary corsairs raided as far north as Iceland. The numbers were staggering, between 1 and 1.25 million Europeans captured and enslaved between the 16th and 19th centuries. But knowledge doesn't penetrate the walls we build around normalcy. Baltimore's residents had constructed their lives on a foundation of selective attention. Yes, pirates existed. But pirates happen to other people. Other villages. The mind does this, it has to. We cannot function under the weight of every possible catastrophe, so we create what psychologists call a just world hypothesis. The unconscious belief that bad things happen to those who deserve them, and since we are good, we are safe. Thomas Crook, the settlement's founder, had even been accused of piracy himself. The irony would have been delicious if it weren't so tragic. The villagers lived adjacent to danger, normalized it, made it part of the landscape. This is the first psychological trap. Familiarity breeds not just contempt, but a dangerous sense of immunity. Sarah Broadbrook went to sleep that night wrapped in invisible armor forged from routine. She had done this 1,000 times. Gone to bed in this house, in this village, surrounded by these people. The brain constructs reality from patterns, and every successful night becomes evidence that tomorrow will be the same. Psychologists call this optimism bias, the tendency to believe we are less likely than others to experience negative events. It's not stupidity. It's survival. Without it, we'd be paralyzed. But it makes us blind to the precipice until we've already stepped off. The authorities knew something was coming. Intelligence reports warned that Murad Rees, a Dutch captain who had converted to Islam after his own enslavement, was planning an attack on the Cork coast. They thought it would be Kinsale. They were wrong. This is where institutional psychology mirrors individual psychology. Organizations, like people, suffer from what's called confirmation bias. They see what they expect to see. Kinsale was bigger, more strategic, more obvious. Baltimore was small, peripheral, forgettable. But the pirates understood something the English authorities didn't. Psychological warfare begins with surprise. Not just tactical surprise, psychological surprise. The kind that doesn't just shock the body but fractures the mind's entire model of reality. When John Hackett, an Irish fisherman they'd captured days earlier, guided Murad Rees's ships into Baltimore's harbor, he was operating under his own psychological trap, the belief that cooperation would save him. It's the first bargain captives make, the first crack in identity. If I help them, I'll be spared. I'm different. I'm useful. He wasn't spared. He was hanged from the cliff outside the village after the raid. But by then he'd already stopped being the person who went to sea that morning. The scream came at 2 a.m. Not a single scream, a chorus. The sound of a village being violated in its most vulnerable state, sleep. Over 200 armed corsairs moved through Baltimore like a surgical strike team, torching thatched roofs, dragging people from their beds. The attack lasted perhaps an hour. In that hour, 107 people, men, women, children, were captured. This is where the psychological breaking begins. Not later in the slave markets. Not during the 5-week voyage to Algiers. Right here, in this moment of absolute helplessness. Captivity narratives from survivors of Barbary raids describe an initial period they called breaking, the first hour aboard the ships, when male captives who didn't stay out of the way were beaten, sometimes hacked to death in what witnesses described as a bloody frenzy. This wasn't random violence. It was psychological engineering. The brain has a threat-response hierarchy: fight, flight, freeze, fawn. When fighting is impossible and flight is blocked, the mind moves to freeze, a kind of psychological paralysis. But the corsairs didn't allow even that. They created an environment where the only viable response was fawn, immediate, total compliance. Sarah Broadbrook, if she survived those first hours, records suggest 3 women from Baltimore eventually returned, though their names weren't recorded, would have learned this instantly. Her survival depended on erasing herself, becoming invisible, responding to commands before they were fully spoken. The 5-week voyage to Algiers was a masterclass in psychological dismantling. Survivor accounts describe conditions of extraordinary deprivation. 42 men shut up in a dark room in the hold, filthy in extreme, destitute of every nourishment and nearly suffocated. But here's what's psychologically crucial. Women and children were treated differently. They were given curtains for privacy, facilities for washing, freedom of movement below decks. An Icelandic account from a 1627 raid described the kindness shown towards children by the crew. This is where the mind starts to fracture in a specific way. The differential treatment creates what psychologists now call cognitive dissonance. The psychological discomfort of holding 2 contradictory beliefs simultaneously. These people are monsters who murdered my neighbors exists in the same mind as these people showed my child kindness when they could have killed them. The mind cannot sustain that tension. Something has to give. And what typically gives is the first belief. Because the second belief, the one about kindness, about humanity, offers something the first cannot: hope. This is how Stockholm Syndrome begins. Not through love or sympathy, but through the brain's desperate need to resolve unbearable contradictions. If my captors are human, if they can show mercy, then perhaps I can survive by appealing to that humanity. Perhaps I can earn safety through compliance, through connection, through becoming valuable to them. It's not weakness. It's the mind trying to create a survivable reality from an unsurvivable situation. On July 28, 1631, 5 weeks after being torn from their beds, the people of Baltimore arrived in Algiers. The official record is brutally clinical. Muratto, Fleming, and his consort from Baltimore in Ireland, 89 women and children and 20 men. The slave market wasn't just a place of physical transaction. It was a theater of identity destruction. Captives were stripped, examined, categorized by their potential utility. Some would become galley slaves, chained to oars until their bodies failed. Others would labor in quarries or fields. Women faced the particular horror of the harem, where their bodies became property and their personhood became performance. But something else happened in that market. something psychologists studying captivity have identified as a critical moment of identity collapse. The realization that you are no longer a subject of your own life story. You are an object in someone else's. According to research on trauma and captivity, this moment triggers what's called learned helplessness, the psychological state where a person believes they cannot change their situation no matter what they do. It's not giving up. It's the brain recognizing correctly that the old rules, the assumptions about agency, rights, protection, no longer apply. The Bashaw governor of Algiers had first choice of 15 slaves. This meant standing in a line, waiting to be selected like livestock, knowing that your entire future depended on the whims of a man who saw you as a commodity. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. This is where many captives reported the final dissolution of their former identity. They stopped being English fishermen or Irish farmers. They became Christian slaves. Their religion, previously a personal identity, became their primary classification. Their names often disappeared into records as generic descriptors: an Englishman, a woman from Baltimore. Some records suggest that communities of new Muslims and Turks by profession existed in Algiers, former Christians including Irish captives who had converted to Islam and joined pirate crews themselves. This wasn't just religious conversion. It was psychological reinvention. Here's where the erosion becomes total, when captives not only accept their new reality but actively participate in perpetuating it. When they become the very thing that destroyed them. Psychologists call this identification with the aggressor, a defense mechanism where the victim adopts the characteristics, values, or behaviors of their abuser. It serves multiple psychological functions. It resolves the unbearable cognitive dissonance between victim and victimizer. It provides a sense of power in a powerless situation, and it offers belonging in a state of absolute isolation. Conversion meant survival. It meant better treatment, potentially freedom. But it also meant participating in your own psychological annihilation. Because you weren't just changing religions, you were accepting the fundamental premise that your former self, your former community, your former beliefs had no inherent value. That they could and should be discarded. The Baltimore captives who converted faced an impossible choice: maintain their identity and remain enslaved, potentially forever, or shed everything they'd been and join the society that had destroyed them. Of the 107 people captured from Baltimore, only 3 women are confirmed to have returned home. 3 out of over 100 souls who went to sleep that June night thinking tomorrow would be another ordinary day. Where did the others go? Some died from disease, exhaustion, despair. Some became permanent residents of a foreign land, their names lost to history. Some converted and disappeared into their new identities so completely that they became unrecognizable to anyone who had known them before. But 3 women came back. The psychological journey they must have made, from capture to enslavement to ransom to return, represents one of the most extraordinary mental transformations a human can experience. Research on returned captives shows they face what's called repatriation trauma, the psychological crisis of returning to a world that moved on without them while they were frozen in an experience no one else can comprehend. They're expected to resume their old identities, but those identities were destroyed years ago. They're different people now, wearing the skin of who they used to be. One Icelandic reverend, Olafur Egilsson, captured in a 1627 raid, was released without his pregnant wife and children and sent back to ask the Danish king for ransom. He wrote a narrative of his experience, one of the few first-person accounts we have. His description of being set free while his family remained enslaved is psychologically devastating. the guilt of survival, the helplessness of separation, the impossible burden of having to explain the unexplainable to authorities who had never experienced anything remotely similar. But what about Baltimore itself? The village that remained after the raid? Most survivors moved inland to Skibbereen, abandoning their coastal homes. For decades, Baltimore was a ghost town, empty houses, a crumbling stockade where John Hackett had been executed, smoke-stained walls marking where families had slept their last night of peace. This is collective trauma. The entire social fabric of a community, ripped apart in an hour, never properly repaired. The survivors couldn't rebuild Baltimore because the place itself had become a wound. Every street corner was a memory of who was taken. Every empty house was a reminder of the illusion of safety they'd believed in. Psychologists studying mass trauma events, from natural disasters to genocides, have found that communities often cannot recover in the place where the trauma occurred. The geography itself becomes triggering. The landscape doesn't change, but it stops being home and becomes a crime scene. For the 3 women who did return from Algiers, we don't know their names, only that they were ransomed 14 years after their capture. What must that homecoming have been like? 14 years. More than a decade of enslavement. The psychological research on long-term captivity is clear. Extended captivity doesn't just traumatize, it fundamentally rewrites identity. The person who returns is not the person who was taken, no matter how much everyone pretends otherwise. These women would have returned to a Baltimore that barely existed anymore. Their families might have been dead or scattered. The language they'd been forced to learn in Algiers might have become more familiar than their native tongue. The routines of captivity, however horrific, had become their normal. Freedom would have felt foreign. This is the cruelest irony of rescue. Sometimes the cage becomes the only reality you know how to navigate. Research on Stockholm Syndrome and trauma bonding shows that victims often struggle to leave even when given the opportunity, not because they love their captors, but because their entire psychological framework for survival is built around captivity. The women who returned home carried 2 people inside them, who they had been and who they'd been forced to become. Neither person could exist fully. The first was a ghost of innocence lost. The second was a creature of survival that didn't fit in normal society. Here's what haunts me about the Baltimore raid and the broader story of Barbary captivity. We still ask the wrong questions. We ask, how could this happen? Why didn't the English government protect them? Why didn't European powers stop the raids? But the real question is, why do our minds make us vulnerable to this particular form of destruction? The answer is uncomfortable, because the same psychological mechanisms that make us resilient in normal circumstances, our ability to adapt, to find patterns, to create meaning from chaos, to form bonds even in terrible circumstances, become weapons against us in captivity. The optimism bias that lets us get out of bed every morning despite knowing we could die any moment made the villagers of Baltimore vulnerable to surprise. The cognitive dissonance resolution that helps us make sense of contradictory information made captives vulnerable to Stockholm Syndrome. The learned helplessness that prevents us from futilely fighting impossible odds made slaves vulnerable to accepting their enslavement as permanent. Our survival mechanisms can become our prisons. The Barbary slave trade ended in the 1830s when France colonized Algeria and European naval power finally crushed the Corsair strongholds. But the psychological patterns it revealed didn't end. They continue in every hostage situation, every abusive relationship, every totalitarian regime, every human trafficking operation. The same cognitive mechanisms that trapped Sarah Broadbrook in 1631 trap victims today. The normalization of danger, We live next to threats we can't constantly acknowledge, so we minimize them until they become invisible. The surprise fracture. When the unthinkable happens, it doesn't just shock us. It shatters our entire model of reality. The breaking period. The initial overwhelming of all resistance through force and fear. The kindness trap. Small mercies from captors creating unbearable cognitive dissonance that resolves by humanizing the oppressor. The identity erosion. The slow dissolution of who we were, replaced by who we must become to survive. The conversion moment. When adaptation becomes collaboration, when survival strategies become new identities. The impossible return. When rescue doesn't restore us because the person who could be restored no longer exists. The Barbary pirates succeeded not because they had better ships or more weapons, but because they understood something fundamental about human psychology. Identity is fragile. It requires constant reinforcement from our environment, our community, our roles, our routines, our certainties. Strip all that away. Put someone in a hold for 5 weeks, sell them in a market, force them to serve a master who could kill them on a whim, and identity doesn't just bend. It shatters. And from those shards, the mind builds something new. It has to. Survival requires it. What should terrify us is not that this happened to Europeans 400 years ago. It's that the psychological vulnerability hasn't changed. We are all one traumatic fracture away from becoming someone we wouldn't recognize. The villagers of Baltimore weren't weak or foolish. They were human. They had the same brains we have, the same psychological architecture. Which means we have the same vulnerabilities. The 3 women who returned from Algiers after 14 years probably never told the full truth of what happened to them. How could they? Who could understand? Captivity narratives from that era, when they exist at all, are sanitized, performative, shaped by publishers who wanted adventure stories, not psychological horror. They emphasized physical hardships, the chains, the labor, the deprivation, because those were comprehensible. But the real horror was invisible. The moment you realize you're starting to think like they want you to think. The day you notice you've forgotten what your mother's voice sounded like. The night you dream in your captor's language and wake up not sure which language is actually yours. The creeping awareness that you're becoming complicit in your own erasure. This is what the Barbary pirates truly captured. Not just bodies, but the capacity for self-determination. Not just freedom, but the psychological foundation that makes freedom meaningful. And here's the question that should keep us awake. If we were taken tomorrow, torn from our beds, stripped of our context, isolated, broken down, and forced to build new identities around our own subjugation, how long would we last before we forgot who we were? A month? A year? 14 years? Or would we be like John Hackett, convinced that cooperation would save us, only to discover too late that survival through collaboration is just another form of dying? The people of Baltimore thought they were immune because they were good, because they were English, because terrible things happened to other people in other places. They were wrong. And if we think we're immune, that our modern world, our technology, our laws protect us from the fundamental vulnerability of human psychology, we're making the exact same mistake. The cage isn't always physical. Sometimes it's built inside our own minds, one rationalization at a time, one small compromise at a time, until we can't remember what freedom felt like or why we wanted it in the first place. That's what the Barbary pirates understood. That's what we still don't want to admit. The village of Baltimore was eventually repopulated in the 18th century. Today, a pub called the Algiers Inn commemorates the raid. Tourists visit. The harbor is peaceful. But on June 20th each year, if you know the story, You can almost hear the screams that echoed through those streets 4 centuries ago, screams that didn't just mark the capture of bodies, but the systematic dismantling of minds. And you wonder, how many modern captivities are we walking past right now, normalized, invisible, hiding in plain sight?